To start, CRL would like to thank the NEH for the funding that made this one-year planning grant possible. And it's important to state that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The CRL has been involved in preservation since its inception in 1949. In the past decade, the need to preserve enough print copies of serial titles has been a focus for CRL members. For this reason, CRL provides support for collaborative shared print efforts through meetings and services, most specifically through the paper database and the PAN semi-annual Print Preservation Forum, held on the Friday before ALA Midwinter and Annual. PAN gives anyone with an interest the chance to participate and learn about the latest shared print activities. We encourage everyone to come to our meetings and learn what's happening with shared print and related activities across the United States, Canada, and the world. CRL also provides data analysis and assessment of collections in support of digital and print preservation programs. We encourage you all to learn about these services and how they can help your library's participation in print preservation efforts. You will see a little of what we're doing in the work we present today. Through analysis of shared print serials data, CRL has come to the conclusion that scholarly journals are at great risk of loss. In 2017, with the help of the Mellon Foundation, CRL compared the titles committed to shared print programs against serial titles held in the collections of 18 large academic libraries. We found only about 9% of the serials in this critical corpus of collections was committed to print archive programs. This led CRL to the conclusion that there is a need to find more preserved journal titles. CRL decided to widen the safety net by looking at what print titles might be preserved through reformatting to alternate formats. CRL looked for new caches of titles understood to be preserved for library use in the NEH Brittle Books programs and vendor data from NAPC, UMI, and digital data from the Law Library Microfilm Consortia. Our hypothesis was that print journals reformatted through reliable preservation and digitization programs would address a significant gap in actionable information for libraries responsible for the stewardship of critical humanities resources. The project we are discussing today is an investigation of bibliographic data for approximately 20,000 humanities serial publications preserved on microfilm and in digital form, to determine how such information could best be combined with the Print Archives Preservation Registry, otherwise known as PAPER, to facilitate acquisition and preservation decisions for libraries. Just a little bit of history about the NEH projects. They started in the mid-1980s when the library community was facing a collections problem. A large portion of the books published between 1850 and the early 1980s were printed on cheap, mass-produced paper that as it aged became brown, crumbly, and unusable. A movement to preserve the contents of the volumes was necessary to ensure an enormous body of historical material was not lost. At the time, microfilm was the standard medium for preservation. The NEH support for brittle books reformatting projects was formally funded in 1988, but the first project of its kind was in 1983. NEH provided a grant to the Research Libraries Group to initiate a cooperative preservation microfilming project that became a model for the nationally coordinated Brittle Book Preservation Microfilming Program. The Preservation and Reformatting Program was launched by the endowment in 1988. NEH received increased congressional funding through appropriations and began distributing grants from 1988 through 2008. NEH provided the funds to libraries, library consortia, and some museums to preserve the content of brittle books through reformatting them from print to microfilm and later some digitization. The work involved at least 82 institutions in projects that preserved the intellectual content of approximately 3 million embrittled volumes on a large range of subjects pertaining to United States history and culture. Initially, monographs were targeted, but as work got underway, projects began to include journals, archive content, and newspapers. This was due in part to a requirement from NEH that a title be reformatted only once. Books to be filmed were identified through a fold test where the corner of a page was bent back and forth 3 times, and if it became weakened or fell off the volume, it was identified as a brittle book. Over a short period of time, many standards evolved for these projects. Among the most important were those related to creation of the physical microfilm. Around this time, there was a major breakthrough in materials used for microfilming. Polyester, a better material than acetate, which deteriorated quickly, became the preservation standard for microfilm and was required for all NEH projects. NEH required 3 films be created: a master for dark storage, a print master for creating access copies, and an access copy held in the library and circulated to local users and through interlibrary loan. The preservation and print masters were kept off-site in climate-controlled storage, which was also required by the NEH. In many cases, participating libraries continue to pay to maintain and create access copies for these same masters. Recently, the masters for both Solinet and RLG projects were contributed to the Library of Congress, though we do not know what they will do with them. For cataloging, NEH required libraries use ARL's Guide to Bibliographic Records for Preservation Microfilm Master. ARL's guide relied on several ANSI/AIM archival standards for producing microfilms, the AACR2, and the U.S. MARC format for bibliographic data. The RLG Preservation Microfilming Handbook was also used by those participating in microfilm reformatting programs. Libraries were encouraged to save time by cloning print records and adding additional information about the projects in various MARC fields. The 533 reproduction note field was recommended. Practices varied by program and library. The examples that you see on this slide were created by RLG Art Serials projects done in 1993 and a Solinet project done in 2006. The examples show how the record standards evolved over time. The Art Serials record was created in 1993, and at that time, the 533 had not been well defined. As you can see, the links to the reformatted content, that is, the 900 field, show the NEH grant that was cited for this project. Later, the 533 subfield F was used for this same information. As many of you must realize, a local 955 field would not be included in an OCLC bibliographic record, nor would it be searchable. So discovering if this reel was created through an NEH grant would be impossible in OCLC. Variations such as this made it difficult to discover all the NEH records. We know there were more serial titles reformatted in these programs than we found in OCLC. Firstly, we know because we asked institutions who we knew participated in these projects, and they told us their records hadn't been included in OCLC. It's likely there are others with local records not in OCLC. Grant participants were required to deposit their records to a national database. However, at the time, ARLIN, RLG's bibliographic database, was equal to OCLC in importance. ARLIN was used at least as much as OCLC in these projects. The problem is that when ARLIN data was merged with OCLC's, some fields were not a one-to-one match with OCLC records, and some information was lost or incomplete. We have also been told by some participants that RLG sent ARLIN records back to the libraries to put into OCLC, and some may not have done this. Suffice it to say, not everything that was in ARLIN made it to the OCLC records, and in some cases this meant the link to the NEH grant was lost. We also found some serial titles in the project reports that were not properly identified in their OCLC record. This probably wasn't caused by the ARLIN situation. Local practice was to clone print records and add a few fields which indicated this was a reformatted title. Not all libraries were equally dedicated to this work, and we found examples of known NEH titles with no microfilm records, though sometimes the microfilm was attached to the print record with no notes regarding the NEH's role in the creation of the reel. It is also important to note that NEH required the reporting of the number of volumes reformatted, but did not require a list of what was filmed. Many NEH final reports do not detail what was filmed or what library can provide an access copy. Without this information available, some libraries may not remember that they have obligations to store and provide access to the content on these reels. It should be noted that the news is not all bad. Some projects like Solinet, now Lyrasis, and later RLG projects did a good job of creating a link that we found, and we are grateful to these catalogers. To help understand data from reformatting projects, CRL added other sources for the testbed. titles from the UMI NAPC microfilm serials were also added. These were commonly held titles reformatted from print by UMI, later ProQuest, and finally NAPC. These titles were supplied by NAPC to CRL on a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet contains some wonderfully detailed information. We also included the Law Library Microfilm Consortium digital records. We were going to use their microfiche records, but the digital was more up to date, as LLMC started creating microfiche and became strictly digital in 2002. Paper already includes LLMC's print records, so the digital was added as an experiment to see how paper could handle the new format and to see if librarians would want an additional backup copy in an alternate format. And now I will turn it over to Amy, who will discuss the testbed of records we found and if they are viable for ingestion into paper. Amy?
Thanks, Marie. So as you can see on the screen, the testbed of records compiled for this planning project totaled 20,305 and included records for NEH-funded preservation microfilm projects, the National Archive Publishing Company publications, and LLMC Digital. As Marie explained earlier, identifying MARC records for the NEH-funded preservation microfilm projects proved to be much more challenging than expected. All records were meant to be contributed to the National Database of Record, but Marie gave a little bit of the background for that, and I've come to believe that National Database of Record really was kind of what they meant really was our system of databases that share a common format of the MARC record. Therefore, multiple sources for the records were sought. For the NEH records, we found the metadata describing the titles and holdings was detailed and reliably consistent within record sets. And that's really important because I think we can change how we deal with records across record sets, but as long as they're consistent within the record set, that helps greatly. And that's due to the shared commitment of the NEH and ARL to support a pragmatic approach to using the cataloging rules of the time, but to encourage compliance by setting a baseline below which the records would not prove to be useful. But rules for useful access to those microfilm sets was a much more local context or for a much more specific audience than we currently imagine for titles committed for retention in shared print collections. So the question is still, are these records useful in our work today? The chart on the right side of the slide shows that in the aggregate, 97% of our testbed of records had holdings. Explicit or implied gaps using standard holdings expressions were included in about 15% of the records with holdings. And an additional single volume or short runs for the Small Art Journals project seemed to include holdings in the dates of publication and imprint subfields, but without being able to verify that, we did not include those in our final count as having holdings. So each record group had a different format for its metadata. MARC for the library records, a detailed spreadsheet from NAPC, and KBART for LLMC. But within each group, records were detailed and consistently formed. For example, with the LLMC, only about 10% had ISSNs, but all had OCLC numbers, from which we could get a more detailed MARC record. And all except for one LLMC record had holdings in it. And I suspect that the missing holdings were really due to a glitch in compiling or transferring the metadata rather than a lack of attention to quality. For the holdings, the NAPC listed explicit holdings at the volume level in separate metadata fields in their spreadsheet. And LLMC did not provide gaps or condition information, but I think part of their program explicitly says that they try to compile full runs of material. So the records really should be taken in context with the program. For the NEH, the guidelines for creating bibliographic records for preservation microfilm encourage catalogers to clone print records, and the majority of the microfilm records were coded to indicate that they had been cloned. Therefore, the quality of the bibliographic description in the microfilm records was dependent on the quality of the original cataloging. For holdings for the NEH records, the guidelines prescribed using the U.S. MARC format for holdings data and to include holdings information in the bib record until this information could be consolidated in the holdings format. And although most of the records did include holdings, the guidelines for recording holdings and preservation actions did not include noting levels of validation of the material or a description of the validation process. So presumably there was an attempt to use the best copy available for reproduction, but condition information also is rarely included in the actionable data. However, gaps that were listed were usually in the implied in the holding statements with the proper punctuation or with lax statements at the end of the holding statements. Researchers and librarians have too often seen reproductions of uneven or bad quality and need assurance of quality to include collections of microfilm in decision-making related to print collections. So in the current environment, we really need that actionable data that can be processed in batch that tells us about the gaps and the condition. Once we've found the records to test CRL's hypothesis that reliable preservation and digitization programs would address a significant gap in actionable information, we compared the titles to those registered in paper. 44% of the full set, the NEH, NAPC, and LLMC, were in paper, but most of the overlap came from NEH and from LLMC. The NEH were relatively easy to identify because about 80%, as we saw on the other slide, 80% of those titles had ISSNs in their records, and LLMC had a fairly high overlap, not because they had that ISSN, but because when we first ingested their records, we spent several months trying to map the digital to various print records. And it is not a project that I would do over. And it's not one that's practical, I think, for most shared print programs. Only 103 titles from the almost 6,000 NEH microfilm titles were identified in paper through batch search methods. And I think there are two important reasons for this. One, that shared print collections have focused primarily on widely held titles, while the NEH preservation microfilming projects addressed more scarcely held titles. And two, the majority of the titles lacked an ISSN, and print and microfilm copies share the same ISSN. Therefore, that ISSN is really important for bringing the multiple format records together. And it is I think the single most important thing if we were to go forward with using microfilm or microform collections to augment the print and shared print collections. Us having an ISSN assigned to these historic journals is, I think, the single most important piece of metadata that we currently lack. The absence of these titles from shared print collections does underscore their importance of incorporating these collections into the shared print. They represent a part of the long tail that is not represented in the serial shared print collections. To assess whether the particular holdings for a title or a particular microfilm copy can help fill the gap of information, we need to look to the 533 field in the MARC record of those old microform records and compare it to the kind of information that you find in the current 583 MARC field that the shared print community uses to disclose their shared print holdings. And this slide shows an example of each of those. And it really shows some of the best of these fields that we've seen in both the microform and the shared print collections. And I think it's good to we often highlight the sort of bad examples or the examples of bad metadata, and I think it's really good to highlight once in a while the really good ones, because I think if you were to start to try to incorporate these collections into a shared print program, you'd want to start with those that have the best data. These two are not a one-to-one match, obviously, but they do have important overlapping data elements. They have material specified, and the action, or in the 533, sort of the result of the action, that subfield A with microfilm in it, the place and date and project. But most important of the new elements that are in the 583, or in the LHR, that actually, the local holdings record, that actually incorporate more than the 583, but several other fields to sort of round out the metadata that we need. The most important of these, I think, are provenance, validation, and location. These are all missing from the MARC records from the earlier microform project. And while I think you could find that information in project reports or just other information not in the catalog record, we really are at the point where we are communicating all of our most important information in the record that goes with the item. It, I think, is the place where it is at least risk to be lost. So we have some recommendations for the future for any preservation reformatting projects that are going forward, or for ones that may have already been completed but you may want to include in your shared print programs. And I just have them listed here with, I think, in order of importance. I think it's extremely important to work with the shared print program to archive the originals. Many of these that were microformed, we don't have a record of what happened to the originals, and it's certainly not attached to the record itself. I think it's important to develop strategic collaborative reformatting programs. Most of these, they may have been part of a sort of a phase or a group of projects, but they seem in many ways to act individually, just local library needs. I think it's important to register those programs' commitments in a national database. So not just registering the records or the commitments, but information about the programs, like what we have in the paper directory in our paper database. And it's important to establish the ISSNs for historic journals. I think I can't say that enough. And to ensure that those ISSNs are consistently and accurately used, one of the surprising things we found with the NACP group was we found about 416 records, ISSNs, that were not in the ISSN database. So for whatever reason, they never became official, and it's just very difficult to use them properly then. We need to use common commitment disclosure metadata. I think there, as I pointed out before, I think there's much in the 533 and the current standard for disclosing data that we can marry. But I think it is important going forward that we do that. And we need to create accessible, structured provenance metadata for collection management decision, and also linked to a contingency plan. I think there's very little talk about that, and it's extremely important. So that kind of wraps up what we have for this presentation,